Okay, so we are starting this project, which I'm calling Cyber Weapons Lab, because a lot of you are CS or STEM majors, and you guys actually kind of understand the way that this works on a technical level. So I thought it would be useful to start teaching you guys some of the things that are actually happening nowadays when people talk about like cyber attacks and cyber war. These are the kind of fundamental principles that underlie all these tactics and things that are going on. Nowadays, when I would interview people, one of the first things I would do for various startups I work for, one of the first questions I would ask them is, how do you find information that you don't already know? And the majority of people would say a Google search or something like that. And the tendency is to just look in kind of obvious places. And the tendency is also to use the kind of tools that allow you to be kind of lazy with search, using keywords, letting Google kind of like do the heavy lifting for you. But you're trading a lot of control. So the essence of OSINT, which is open source intelligence, is being able to use the vast ocean of data that is out there that is not accessible by Google to build very, very detailed profiles on specific entities, organizations, people. It really depends on what your use case is. Now the problem is there's so much information out there that if you don't understand what it is you're doing or what question you're trying to answer, you will get lost and you will just end up it's like getting stuck on watching YouTube videos. You'll end up just finding all this information that is really interesting but has nothing to do with what it is you're trying to learn. In order to be an effective researcher, you're going to need to learn to look at these things like what they are. These are basically weapons. They can be used to cause a ton of damage. These same tactics can be used to take out infrastructure in an entire country. They can be used to take out a multi-million-dollar business. These are the same kinds of tools that were used to take out Sony and other organizations that were attacked. Because these are tactics that are incredibly powerful. So they can be used for business applications, and a lot of these tools I'm going to be teaching you today I've actually used at various startups, and they were blown away because they need this kind of data in order to operate their business. They need to know what server does our competitor use? That kind of information is a couple taps away with Maltego. So that's why I've chosen today to kind of open with something that everybody can relate to, not some crazy specific zip bomb cyber weapon or something. This is something that anybody can jump into and use the free community edition and start learning how to research like an intelligence analyst and not like someone who's Googling. Because Google is fine, especially if you know how to use it, but the majority of information on the internet is not there. So when you think of cyber warfare versus traditional warfare, people tend to think of firing guns or shooting missiles. Who here knows how to fire a gun? Yeah? Anyone? Who here knows how to code a program? Cool. So in the future, those skills are going to be far more dangerous than knowing how to fire a gun, shoot a missile, because those kinds of attacks can only be against very limited places. Cyber weapons can be everywhere. They can affect things that you would never imagine would be affected. And what's interesting is with a little bit of code, you can be far, far, far more destructive to a society that relies on computers and automation than you ever could be with a gun or a bomb or even a missile. So planning and launching a cyber attack is more like writing a program than firing a gun or launching a missile. There are stages that you have to go through that are very similar to the same things you'll do when writing your first C++ program. Without careful study of the target and the specific objective you're trying to complete, your attack is going to be inefficient and poorly planned, kind of like maybe your first spaghetti code. So if you know what that is, it's when someone gets excited about solving a problem, they go ahead and start writing the code before they write their pseudocode and actually plan out all the steps that need to happen. And by the time they get to the end, something doesn't work, or they find something else that means they need to change it, or they didn't read the original question. So the end result is this big, complicated mess that doesn't end up maybe it accomplishes the objective, but when you get it, you're just like, I don't even know if this person knows how to read. The code works, but it's so crazy and long and inefficient that it's not a practical way of going about this. Cyber attacks work the same way. You have to study your target, and you have to build something that is optimized for that specific environment, the same way that you need to be efficient with CPU usage and power consumption and all the other factors you need to consider when designing a computer program. So if you do not invest the resources in reconnaissance, which is the first stage of anything in kind of this whole realm, then you will not be efficient. You will have to rely on either default tools that are not suited for what you're doing. You'll have to rely on third-party information. You'll basically not be in control of what you're doing. So what I'm about to teach you guys, reconnaissance, is something that applies to business in terms of making investments. It's things that apply to cyber warfare in terms of directing your energy for attacks. You never, ever, ever want to go after just kind of like some default target because one, it'll link you to it because it's the thing you do every single time. And two, it's probably not the best way to attack that specific target if you'd actually taken the time to research it. So most people think that takes too much time. They'll tend to jump into like the sexiest part of it, but they don't realize this is actually the sexiest part of it. Because you can run around trying to attack an organization for, in my case, a red team where we would be attempting to figure out like the problems before an attacker would come in and tell them how to fix them. We would go in and be able to find that maybe one very small subdomain was unsecured that would allow us to attack the entire network rather than going through all the other steps of trying to crack into their computers or breaking into their Wi-Fi. If we can find one small insecure piece that brings down the entire foundation, it saves us tons and tons and tons of time and energy. And that's what we're trying to do with this process. So recon defines every single step that follows. It's the act of researching a target, building a better picture, and coming up with a plan of action based on the information you find. If you come up with your plan before you do recon, it's not a good plan, generally. To be good at recon, you have to think like a researcher, and you have to ask answerable questions, and be able to spot patterns of data, and be creative where you look for information. So those are kind of the foundations of being a good researcher. If you pull bad data into whatever it is you're doing, you're not going to get a good answer. If you don't have a good question in the first place, no matter what the data you're pulling in is, it's still not going to be a satisfying answer because you didn't have a satisfying question in the first place. It's not something that can be answered. Maybe it's an opinion, maybe it's an open-ended question. So the goal of this recon, again, is to identify low-hanging fruit. Problems, issues that weren't diagnosed, things that they probably don't think are publicly available to see. Every time you do recon, it is an investigation. You don't just jump into recon and start kind of like looking for stuff. I mean, you can if you truly have nowhere to start. But generally, you should have an idea of what you're trying to learn about an organization, even if it's just, how many subdomains does this place have? Like, how many different businesses does this one place serve? All these things can be found with open source intelligence. So open source intelligence is huge. It's a branch of the military, it's a branch of the civilian intelligence services, and it's a core part of business intelligence. It's what allows big businesses to pay smart researchers, like potentially you guys, to help them figure out where to put their money, how to invest their resources, and even kind of how to build new products. So business intelligence is essential because it uses the same kinds of open source tools to, instead of spying on another country, basically like spy on the business environment around you, including competitors and other people that are maybe doing the same thing, to figure out like how they're doing it. So a lot of the time, if you're developing a new product, you do not want to start from the ground up. Like, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You want to find people that are already making money doing roughly what you're doing and piggyback off what they're doing so you can focus on what makes your product different. So if your goal is to do that, and you want to just be able to point at a service and enumerate exactly like what web server they use, what hosting service they use, what email service they use, you can do that with this. So for business, this is tremendously valuable because it gives you all the information on a competitor without even really having to talk to them or mine for more data. So the information found in databases can often only be queried through APIs. That is a problem if you just know Google. What's interesting about OSINT is we can start to dive into pools of data that are much larger than can be analyzed by an individual person. So one thing that we kind of forget about is that people contribute a ton of information about themselves on social media. We have to, kind of as a society. Even to be able to see this video later, you're gonna have to be part of our Discord or Facebook. So most of us have signed up for something. But since these are free products, we are actually the product when we sign up and use these things, because our data that we put into them is what they have to sell to marketers, but also we can just kind of access it with an API and start to look for relationships that people don't think they're giving away by volunteering a little bit of information on Facebook. But when you tie that to a whole bunch of other information and start mining for patterns, that little bit of information you might be giving up on your Facebook, if it's not locked down, is enough to tell a ton of information about you. And that is what this is kind of all about. Taking a small piece of data and enumerating it until we can find vast, vast sums of kind of the right kind of data. Not just everything, but specifically what we're looking for. So mining, analyzing, and sorting information to look for relationships is what this is all about. If you're just sitting there going through this data manually, if you're Googling these things and like trying to keep in mind all the stuff you're finding, it's really fun. And that's probably how you guys have done your own investigations. If you've ever had somebody message you online and you think they're a catfish and they're acting a little weird and you have to track down like inconsistencies. Like, this is the same skill. It's just on the level where it's point and click. So rather than having to catch somebody in a lie, you can literally find out exactly where their email's coming from, find other subdomains on it, and know, like, oh, like, you're with this company. You're using the same server, and it's a private server. Open and shut. So the intelligence cycle is really important to understand. This is something that stands between like researchers and people that are able to produce things like intelligence that actually is worth investing money in. So data is not the same as intelligence. You can find a whole bunch of information about a topic, and if it's not digested into context, if basically you don't kind of distill it into something that another person can understand without taking this deep dive that you took, then it's not valuable information. So part of the process of research and recon is taking raw data, looking for patterns, putting it in context, and then coming up with a product, an analysis, to disseminate so other people can see what it is that you found and what it is that you've learned. So Maltego is important in this because it actually graphically represents all the data that we're mining, so we can share our results and our discoveries with other people. Now, if you're trying to just do this in your head, that's really hard. So Maltego is a tool to help you like develop this collection cycle to find data, refine it into insight, turn that into analysis, and then kind of create a product that other people can actually use. So in order to begin the investigation, which is what this is, every search through Maltego should be kind of seen as an investigation, you have to ask a good question. So a good example would be, what server technology does Scientology.org use? We can see exactly what they use. It's a definitive question that has an actual answer, and it's relatively simple to actually go and look. Has anybody working at The Guardian had their passwords compromised in a major breach? That one's harder, but it's a question we can definitely answer, depending on what kind of data we pull. So some example of bad questions is Goodwill more secure than CVS? Secure to what? So in order to use this kind of tool, you can't just kind of jump in and make up questions. You have to sit down and actually think about, is the question I'm asking answerable? Because otherwise you're going to pull a ton of data. There will always be information. That's the problem actually with this. There's always information when you try to pull it, but it has to be for the right questions. Because if you're asking the wrong questions to begin with, you're going to find a bunch of information, but it's not going to tell you anything. So this is kind of the last, kind of going over that. We start with raw data. That's bits, no content, lots of noise. You're going to get false hits, information that's not necessarily accurate, and your goal is to refine that upwards into intelligence. And that's where you guys fit. So there are some frameworks that attempt to replace the analyst, but in this case, you sit somewhere here, where you are filtering the information, deciding what is important and what is not important, and building a picture based on what you find here. So by the time we get to here, kind of the final result of all this, the information should be distilled to the point that nobody needs to know, the very, very small details of where this information was actually found. They need to know the overall 1,000-yard view of what the situation is and what the information you found means. So if you don't provide that, you are not actually providing intelligence. You are collecting data. And that's fine, but people won't pay for it. So I wouldn't pay for it. Anybody can collect data, but it takes an analyst and somebody who knows how to ask good questions and then understand the information that comes back to answer those questions in a way that people will pay for, because it's supported by good data, it's contextualized, and anybody can act on it. That's the thing. Intelligence should always be actionable. Data is not actionable. So that is the difference, kind of the core difference between intelligence and data. And Maltego is a tool for you to turn data into intelligence. So the way that it does that is through a tool called link analysis. Link analysis is a type of knowledge discovery. It's iterative, it is an iterative and user interactive process to spot, attempt to analyze, and clearly visualize patterns in data sets. Now, the problem with link analysis is if you feed it bad or irrelevant data, it makes it useless. So everything I've said about kind of like selecting the right data to put into this is really critical, because if you're using bad data or if you're answering the wrong question, this whole beautiful process does not work, and you will get very frustrating results. So Maltego. Maltego is a canvas onto which you can place data and then use algorithms called transforms to mine for related information. So it takes care of the process of data import, processing, transformation, analysis, and visualization in a single click in most cases. So it pulls from vast APIs of data to be able to search for patterns and clearly display relationships. And commercial partners provide a product called transforms, which are various algorithms for police, military, and intelligence agencies. And what these transforms do is, again, they pull data, they analyze it. Well, first they clean it up, they analyze it, and then they output the information in a very, very specific way to answer a part of an investigation. Who is someone's core friends on Facebook, friends and family? You can pull in hundreds of thousands of Facebook relationships, mine the data for complicated who's friends with who's family, and who's a family unit, who's a friend unit, and come back with an exceedingly precise picture of who somebody spends their life around and who somebody actually is involved in. And companies will pay a lot of money for that. So by designing an algorithm that's able to pull from Facebook APIs, Twitter APIs, other things that people use, they'll discover kind of hidden relationships that a human researcher might not find by themselves and be able to very clearly say, this is who this person hangs out with. This is a political group this person is affiliated with. So because of that, tools like this are actually used to harass journalists. They're used to harass political dissidents. They're used to crack down on people who protest. If you attend protests, these tools are used against you. If you tag yourself in protest, you are inviting yourself into these tools. These tools mine all that kind of data to identify and profile people. If you look at Maltego, if you have it up, the kinds of entities you can add onto the map to start an investigation from are things like terrorist, criminal, incident, weapon. Like there's also normal things like website, person, but the kind of things that this is designed to track is pretty hardcore. So a particular focus on this kind of search is social media, technical infrastructure, tracking of people, organizations, and physical hardware. So if you need to know all the stuff that an organization runs on, this is your ticket. If you need to know about a person based on an alias or a user account and track them across the internet, this is your tool. This is for profiling people, profiling technology, and profiling like actual organizations to tell you what they look like on the people side and on the technology side. So let's jump in. We're going to conduct an OSINT investigation. We are going to answer one of our sample questions, and that was, have any employees of The Guardian had their personal information breached? How would you begin researching that question? So in order to research this via Maltego, which again, no Google, so we're not going to just Google, have any employees of The Guardian had their personal information breached? That would be third-party information, and it's not good. We want primary source information. That means information that's not coming from another party, it's not been digested, it's something that is raw data that we can make our own kind of analysis of. So in order to do this, first we're going to need to find the web domain that employees of The Guardian email from. Next, we're going to need to scrape a list of Guardian employee email addresses so we can actually check and see if they've been breached. And then we're going to have to compare the list of Guardian email addresses against known data breaches and separate employees who have been breached and employees that have not been breached. So second to last, we'll make a list of employees who have had their information stolen in a breach, and then we'll make a list of the specific incidents that the breached employees have been involved in. So we know like actually what happened, like which accounts of theirs had been breached. And then finally, we're going to make a list of the kinds of data that was stolen so we can identify which of these users have had things like their passwords specifically stolen. So I'm not just trying to answer the question, have they had their data breached? I want to be able to answer on the level, have they had their passwords stolen or not in that breach? Pretty challenging. So let's jump in. So first, if you have Maltego open, one of the first thing you can do is press Command T or Control T, and we'll open a new canvas. So when you start with a blank canvas, you can drop literally anything in. It can be a person, it can be a website, it can be anything. So in this case, we're going to start with a web domain. And again, this is something that will be up online later, so if you want to follow along then, if you fall behind a little, don't freak out. So the first thing we're going to do is add a domain. As we can see here, this is a screenshot, but I dropped a domain into the Maltego canvas of theguardian.com. That is by far and large, like obviously the best choice to see if it is maybe their email because it's their website. So by right mouse clicking and typing domain in the search bar, we can also then derive, if we add the website first, if we need to get the domain from that, we can right mouse click on it and then use the domain transform in order to get the domain from it. So that will allow us to search for email addresses related to the domain, and we can do that via searching in the PGP server. So once we have a domain icon, we right mouse click on it, and we'll be able to see a list of available transforms, which means basically available actions we can take to pull more data and attempt to look for relationships. So in this case, PGP is pretty good privacy, which most journalists use. and I happen to know that like the majority of Guardian journalists will be registered in a database like this because journalists need to have a secure way to communicate with like whistleblowers or something like that. So after running a PGP transform, and you guys can follow along with this as well, against @theguardian.com email addresses, I was able to pull this list, which because I was at the time running the community edition, and you will as well, it's limited to 12 results, but we can see we already have a healthy list of people who work at The Guardian and their personal, well, not their work email addresses. So our PGP list also gave us the ability to start looking for something called paste bins. So there's two different types of ways these people's data could have been lost. One of them is an actual data breach, where somebody like goes in and steals their passwords from a third-party service that they have no control over, which is hilarious because a lot of these times people don't even know that their password has been compromised and they're still using it across all of their accounts on the internet. That's a serious problem, and that's kind of what we're mining for with this. So we can also look to see a second kind of breach, which is a paste bin breach. And that means basically somebody like has a whole big list of information or data or like a directory of journalists, and they just drop it into a paste bin, which is a place that you just kind of drop information if you're trying to leak it. So in this case, we can right mouse click on the email addresses we found while selecting all of them at the same time, which would be very difficult to do manually. And we can run a transform called the Have I Been Pawned transform to see if any of these email addresses have been involved in either a data breach or a paste bin leak. So immediately after running that transform, I can see that, there were 2 paste bin posts and 1 data breach already identified, which affected 9 out of the initial 27 users that we found. So we've already, the answer to our question is yes. At this point, we're just gonna go further and try to get a larger sample size to assess how many people on their staff actually have fallen victim to this. But it looks like we can definitively say yes, at least one person at The Guardian has had their data breached. So in order to expand our search, we can also look at the paste bin. So we're not gonna find passwords in that, but we will find other email addresses. And in this case, there's a particular paste bin incident that I can see 9 of the users were involved in, which means that it's probably a big, long list of Guardian email addresses if 9 of our sample email addresses are included in it. So by navigating to that post bin link, I was able to find an additional 97 Guardian email addresses. So in order to add this, we can simply copy those email addresses and paste them into Maltego, and it will actually interpret them as email addresses and just add them to our investigation as though we'd found them in the first place, which is super valuable because we can take data that we find in the course of the investigation and add it to the canvas. So in this case, we can expand also on the one user who was breached that we found in the first case and find out exactly what data was lost. So it could have been a very simple breach. It could have just been their username, or it could be something much more serious. And we wouldn't know until we ran this additional transform, which is the, again, Have I Been Pawned transform. And this one will pull more information and explain the data that was actually lost in the breach. In this case, we can see that this employee, what was his name? Regis, really wanted to be a part of pay-as-you-go gym, which sounds like a great idea, but it proceeded to lose all of his data. And not just like, the username or something, it lost his email, his password, his phone number, his credit card data, his IP address, and probably some other stuff too. So this guy signed up for some probably not very good gym service and then proceeded to have all of his personal information lost. And odds are the service probably hasn't even reached out to him to let him know that this has happened. So if he's still using the data from this account and any other account of his on the internet, I can pretty much just log into it now after I find those accounts, which is super, super easy to do on Maltego. So if you're able to find someone that's had their data breached and they're using the same password across the internet, they're already screwed. It's just a matter of time before somebody else puts this information together and attempts to enumerate their other accounts and log in with those compromised details. Because people reuse passwords all the time. And this breach was relatively recent. It was in 2016. So if this guy isn't aware of the fact that his data has been lost, then he is at pretty severe risk for having many of his accounts across the web breached, including his Guardian account. So expanding our sample size. After we added the additional 92 Guardian employees to our sample list, we can basically select all of them at the same time and rerun the transform to see if any of them were involved in a breach. So with a larger sample size, it automatically detected them as emails and gave us a new list of incidents that showed actually 5 very significant breaches that their employees had been involved in. So after running through this, instead of the one initial employee we were able to identify 7 Guardian employees who had had their personal data breached rather significantly in 5 separate incidents. So now we've gone from a yes or no question to we're looking at the actual incidents that each one of these employees was involved in, as well as which parts of their data was lost. So at the very bottom here, you can see that the type of information is kind of an option you can select. So if I want to be able to find out only employees that have had their password lost in breaches, basically only employees that have been involved in breaches where there's passwords that have been stolen, I can select the passwords at the bottom, press, I believe it's Command Up, and it will select every breach that has a relationship with it, and then Command Up one more time, and that will select every employee that was involved in a breach that had a password lost. So then I've just generated a list of every employee at the Guardian who has lost their passwords online, and probably very well might not know it. So we did that without knowing who any of these people are. We did that through a couple simple just clicks through data that we put into this ourselves, and we're able to definitively say, like, this guy's lost his password, and it's available on the internet, and if we wanted to guess what his password is, we could probably whittle down this list of people to find the one who was the worst at security, and just pick them to go after. Because if their password is pencil123, then you can guess that whatever password they change it to after this one is probably going to be pencil1234 or something else that's really stupid. So why would you go after the guy who has a crazy long secure password? Like, damn, okay, like, forget that guy. Go after the person with a stupid password that consistently has stupid passwords that uses stupid security procedures. This is how you find them. That's called the weakest link. The lowest hanging fruit, this is them. So sorry guys, I don't know these journalists. And again, like maybe they've changed their passwords, maybe they are now better. But this is things that have happened to them. These people could be excellent at security. Is the problem? If they don't know that they've been breached, it doesn't matter. I want to show you guys another use case. We're kind of coming up on our time though, so if you guys are interested, I can do another like social aspect of this where we go over the transforms that pull from social data. I think you guys would think it's really interesting and creepy because the majority of you guys actually contribute social data, so it's worth it for you guys to see what somebody can do with the data that you're contributing to social networks. I think it will make you change your privacy settings. So very quickly, let's go through another use case, which is following things like money. So there are a lot of organizations that are not very upfront about what they're doing. I've been involved in, I was almost hired at a business that ended up being a front for teaching Scientology values to very young children. And it was only through using tools to kind of find out what was going on behind the scenes that I made that discovery before signing on. So one of the ways that I was able to do something like this is by tracking the way that people make money online. So people use affiliate links in order to get ad revenue or otherwise make money on online property they have, and oftentimes even sneaky organizations are cheap because we live in a capitalist society, so they need to make money and they don't bother to change the affiliate links that they use, even when they have other like front projects that they like don't want to officially acknowledge that they're part of. They will still use the same affiliate link to generate revenue with the same partners because it's generated by a third party like Amazon or Google will give them a link to track money that they're making through traffic to their site. So by searching for other sites in Maltego that have the same tracking link, we can start to find other websites that are unofficially owned by the same entities and are basically making money for the same people. So it's important to be able to find where money's flowing, and this is a good way to be able to do it without having access to bank information. Affiliate codes are really easy to research. So by using our affiliate code transform, I'm going to show you a brief example of how you can enumerate, for example, different businesses somebody might be using as a front. So in this case, I've identified a tracking code being used by Scientology.org that is also in use via all these other subdomains. Now these ones are not as creepy as the ones I found the first round that like seemed very, very unrelated, but some of these subdomains you might not think were related to Scientology, and a lot of them will not ever explicitly acknowledge that they are. That is kind of the thing that they do. So there's a lot of these different organizations that receive funding or other sorts of support from Scientology, but you might not ever expect them to straight out say, like, we are affiliated with Scientology. This definitively links them. So if you need to prove that somebody is on the same organization, on the same team, you can do that in a couple of ways. One of them is if they're using a private server, as we see here. I can enumerate other subdomains by basically searching to see other things that are hosted on the same server. So sometimes you'll just find stuff that's wacky and you'll be like, why is that there? But if it's a private server, it's because they own it. If you find stuff that's totally random, it means it's a shared server and they're just kind of buying hosting space. And that can be useful if you're trying to attack them, because you can find somebody on the server who has terrible security and you don't even need to attack the person you're going after. That's kind of the danger of shared hosting. Or if it's private hosting, you can kind of say like, all right, like if all these domains are on the same host and it's private, it's like an organizational host like this, you can pretty much assume that they're all the same organization. So this is useful for being able to link organizations together and basically build a network of businesses that are all owned by the same people, because people are shady as hell in business and they will have all sorts of like fronts and like other things that have like different names, especially if they have like a nonprofit versus a for-profit. Like you get people that are registering so many business domains that if you can't start to wade through them and see what the hell is actually going on, you won't have the ability to like invest money smartly or like get a job intelligently if you don't know like how many people actually work at this thing. Are the people who run it crazy? Like these are questions you can ask after refining them that can be answered by looking at who the organization is linked to, looking at resources they share, and tracking them across the internet. So we're kind of coming up on our time and I want to take some questions, but this has been a kind of brief example of how you can bring data into Maltego. And again, this can be a website, a person, a name, an alias. Right mouse click on it to see the list of available transforms and start to pull in data, analyze for relationships, and display it on the screen. So Maltego doesn't display very well on the screen. Let's see if I can make it look, oh man, that's really bad. Detail view. Let me get rid of some of this. Okay, so this is kind of a live example of, get out of here, of the transform I was just showing you. This is another example of, this is kind of what I'll go into next time, and I'll just touch on this very quickly. So just adding myself as a person and right mouse clicking twice, I was able to not only find, not my Twitter, but every time I'd been mentioned on Twitter directly by name, as well as, so I found like a bunch of my friends, as well as links back to my Google Plus and a bunch of other information that I don't even know why that's connected. So if you're looking to learn about a person rather than an organization, as we kind of just covered, our next tutorial, or our next kind of a meeting workshop, I guess we'll go into how to use social links and how to use relationships between various types of social media information to derive insight about people. And that can be really fun because it's used for hiring. So a lot of like high-level employers will use this against you. If you're applying for a job, you should be aware of what comes up and the kinds of things that people search for. And you can also start to filter out crazy people. So if you ever get somebody who is acting dishonest or sketchy or weird and you need to conduct your own investigation, then these are the kind of tools where you can very quickly get a handle on someone's social media presence and find, for example, a screen name. A screen name, like as soon as you know someone's screen name, if they use it frequently on the internet, you basically have their entire life. It's using this kind of these kinds of tools because it links people together in ways that they don't think about. So in the end, you get this crazy web of someone's entire online life, which may be a way more complete perspective of them than you would ever get from just interacting with them, briefly in person. And you can really know a lot about a person's motivations, past, like why they do the things they do, just through using tools like this and analyzing the stuff that they themselves volunteer. Again, this is important to think about. None of this information, well, in this case anyway, the other stuff, anything you do in society generates paperwork, but this social media stuff, none of this would exist if you guys didn't contribute it. So the reason why we have all this crazy stuff that can like find people so specifically is because of the urge to share information. It's like we all want to do it, but the only way we really have to do it now is a commercial product in which our data is the product, and we are the people that produces it. So this is one of the many, many, many ways that that data that you guys provide, Facebook and other things, benefits the people that actually pay for Facebook. That's being government agencies, everybody else that uses that data for commercial purposes, either to target activists or identify good business opportunities. Whatever it is, like your data is being used to basically help other people make decisions. Whether it be about figuring out if you're a dangerous activist that needs to be monitored by the FBI, or whether or not you're a good candidate to hire for a company. So think about, I guess kind of the core thing to also reflect on when learning this sort of stuff is, yes, you can pull tons of data from other people and build really invasive pictures about them, but if you're sharing tons of information and you're not careful about the way that that's out there, people can do the exact same thing to you too. So, yeah. I guess that's it. Can I get any questions? Yep.
So what is the legality of this information, and what are the possible legal issues you can run into if you begin to modify or use this?
Right, that's a good question. So open source intelligence is by definition open source, so anybody can access it. So finding this data, mining this data, and pulling this data together is perfectly legal, and it's its own discipline within a lot of different fields. This is a type of research that's very, very specific, but it's very, very powerful. So the reason it's used by so many different agencies is because there's just no, even classified information, human intelligence, like sending spies in, is not as effective or as cheap or as accurate, frankly, as this is. Insofar as the legal trouble you can get in using tools like Maltego, you can definitely get in legal trouble if you run transforms in a way that violates the terms of service of the of what you're using. So you can definitely get your Twitter account or your Instagram account or anything banned or shut down or whatever by using Maltego linked to it to do investigations. Because if you're pulling tons of data and just messing with stuff, they're going to be like, "What in the hell are you doing?" and shut you down because they think you're a bot or something like that. If you do it so hard you break the service, you can get in trouble. So if you modify Maltego, keep in mind, you're pulling so much data here that this is very scalable. These are not, again, toys. These are like military and like government grade tools that if you tell it to, will pull tons and tons of data that you're maybe not supposed to from these services. So you'll probably get away with it once, but then they will probably sue you or have you arrested. So it's important to know before you start messing around with Maltego transforms and like getting into it and changing API keys and stuff. If you're querying from something where you need an API key, or if it warns you that running this transform could get your Twitter account banned, listen to those warnings. They're on screen, so it's not going to be a surprise. But if you do some transform that pulls like you try to pull all the data from Twitter to analyze it, they're going to get so mad at you. So don't do that. But in general, running these tools is legal. And if you're doing it like based off of a tutorial or something, if you're not just out in the bushes just like clicking stuff and like trying to figure out how it works, and you can do that to a certain extent, but if you're not adding specifically powerful third-party transforms and then pushing them to the limit, you're probably not going to get into trouble. But again, if this data wasn't open source, if it wasn't public, it wouldn't be accessible, and we wouldn't be able to pull it into this framework. Yeah.
Combine this with like a Wi-Fi scanner or something, so that you connect to networks, use on the network, and compare with this to find out exactly who is connected to the Wi-Fi network?
Yes, definitely. And there's some really advanced creepy stuff you can do with this. In particular, there's a framework called it's on my laptop, called the Leviathan framework that's able to use these kinds of scanning techniques to identify like country level numbers of computers that are vulnerable or like other like things that might have the same vulnerability. And this tool can be adapted to basically identify vulnerable computers, track malware, and otherwise like find like activity on a network that indicates like criminal activity. So one of the interesting things about this is it can be used to find every vulnerable webcam in Iran that's like vulnerable to a specific vulnerability, and then tools like Leviathan, after you target them, are able to exploit them on like a massive scale, where you can exploit 100,000 vulnerable webcams in Iran or 100,000 vulnerable Internet of Things toasters in Canada very, very nearly by searching by IP address range within a country, and then by like even like specific model type or firmware that it's running. So by integrating tools like Shodan, which I'll also get into probably not next time, but maybe the time after that, which is a search engine that identifies things connected to the internet, not websites, things. If they are vulnerable, you can use that search engine to attack them as well, not just on a local scale, but on the scale of an entire country or series of countries. So it's very, very interesting, very powerful technology because it enables you to mine a vast amount of data and then follow up on it in very specific ways. So the appeal of this is the scalability. It's not just finding one wireless network that's vulnerable, it's finding all of them in an entire country in a way where you can then follow up and target them to. That's actionable intelligence. So the more actionable it is, the better it is, basically, in the kind of intelligence world. So the closer you can get to being able to act on that information you're finding, the better it's kind of considered. All right, thank you guys. Any questions you can...